Welcome to the Golden Flower Podcast, a catalyst for your creative life. I'm Angela Levesque. I'm a digital artist, meditation teacher, wordsmith, and transformational guide based in Boise, Idaho.
And I'm Gemma Kaufman. I'm an abstract painter. I'm a kind of artist storyteller, I'm starting to realize. And I teach meditation and I'm a coach and I'm in Portugal.
Well, today we are talking about the importance of fantasy and imagination. Of course, these play an integral role in our creative process. They serve as catalysts for innovation and problem solving and artistic expression. But and I think Gemma would agree with me, I contend that our constant exposure to digital media and online content creates a dependency on external sources of stimulation. And I think that this undermines not only us as creatives, but I think that this muscle is important for just our visioning for humanity. And I think it's absolutely necessary if we think about ways to deal with our existential threats. So I really think that this is an important topic. Because we are a creative podcast, we like to start off with an excerpt or a passage or something that somebody has written or created on the topic we're about to explore. And today we found a really excellent essay, actually on the Institute, cslewisinstitute.org, written by David C. Downen. And it's called The Uses of Fantasy. So we're going to share a couple of different paragraphs. Gemma, you're going to take the first one, and I'll take the second one, and we'll talk a little bit about that in relationship to our topic today.
Alrighty. So yeah, these are all from the same article, right? And we can put the link in the show notes. I was attracted to this by Anne Nin. She said, all art is especially true of fantasy. It is the function of art to renew our perception. What we are familiar with, we cease to see. So the writer shakes up the familiar scene, and as if by magic, we see new meaning in it. So this kind of renewal that comes from it is the function of art to renew our perception. What we are familiar with, we cease to see. The writer shakes up the familiar scene, and as if by magic, we see a new meaning in it. Yes. Renew.
Well, he goes on later. Again, he talks about C.S. Lewis and he talks about J.R. Tolkien, which I think most people, when they think about fantasy writing, those two would definitely come up. And he talks about J.R. Tolkien went as far as to find fantasy writing as a form of worship, constructing imaginary worlds not for recreation, but for recreation, expressing the imago Dei within oneself, which is like our image of God. For him, fantasy was not one of lower forms of literary expression, but rather one of the highest. His term for it was subcreation, the godlike act of creating not just plots or people, but whole alternative worlds in which they may find a local habitation and a name. And C.S. Lewis spoke for fantasy writers of philosophical persuasions when he commented on what is perhaps the most fundamental drive beyond all literary fantasy. No merely physical strangeness or merely spatial distance will realize the idea of otherness, which is what we are always trying to grasp. You must go into another dimension. To construct plausible and moving other worlds, you must draw on the only real other world we know, that of spirit. So I think all three of these quotes are really talking about ways that we bridge the gap of our differences. And one of the easiest ways to do that, one of the easiest ways to play with our otherness is through creating different worlds, through creating fantasy. And through that, because it's taking us out of the familiar, we're able to explore relationships in ways that we wouldn't otherwise be able to, because it takes us out of that familiar. It creates new ways for us to engage with one another. And so that makes it easier for us to receive than if you took like man against man in a very relatable interaction. Then all of a sudden you're bringing in your previous experience and your programming and your mental constructs. But now you take that same sort of engagement, but you put it in a completely different world. We're able to kind of enter into that relationship in a way that we wouldn't be able to in something that's familiar or that we can draw on from past experience. What are your thoughts on that?
Makes me think of travel and why we want to go and have those travel experiences that, we talk about like, that kind of the mundane and needing to have that change of scene, that kind of renewal. But what we really want is to experience ourselves in a different context, in a different environment, in different relationships. And in that disruption of like experiencing ourselves in the same place in the same way, traveling offers us that opportunity to re-experience ourselves in that different way. And I feel like for me, I have done a fair bit of travel, I guess, especially when I was younger, but I think for me, enacting the fantasy realm and actively working with it for me has been a form of travel. It's been wanting to have that kind of re-experiencing and the renewal, and being creative about the different ways you can get it if it's not like that easy to buy a plane ticket and just disappear.
Yes, I love that. Okay, so let's dive deeper into this idea of imagination and fantasy world and daydreaming, and why it's not just important for us as creatives, but why I think it's necessary for humanity. So we'll get to that in just a moment. Let you start us off today with this idea of exploring fantasy and daydreaming and imagination.
Fantasy, daydreaming, imagination. It's kind of interesting. I was thinking about the difference between a little bit like fantasy seems to have a bit of fear around it and a bit of negative connotation. I don't know if you kind of agree. Vision, on the other hand, seems to be very much encouraged. It's like this kind of idea that we can have vision for our life, but we don't want to go too far into to fantasy. It's like vision is something that feels like you can scaffold it to reality, whereas fantasy seems to have this idea that it goes head on with reality, like it's at odds with reality. And I think as someone who has been kind of judged and criticized, by my family and well, mainly my family, for having this kind of overactive imagination and fantasy, whereas like delusional, escapism, all this kind of stuff can get thrown around. But like you say at the beginning of this podcast, it's just like, oh, don't escape into your own fantasy realm, but zone out on Netflix any day of the week and let someone do it for you. It's kind of like why one socially acceptable modality of escapism is okay, but working with your generating and your own kind of raw material is like somehow a bit not so okay. I don't know
Well,
which direction.
I would
Yeah.
argue that you can't have vision without fantasy.
Mm.
Imagination is being able to conjure up ideas, thoughts, images that are not coming from our five senses. So they're not immediately like, oh, I see this and now I'm creating something that's off of that. It's really like an internal generative process where you're able to come up with things without having external stimulation being like the cause of it. And so when we think about visioning, when we think about, what we would like for our futures, when we think about, dreaming what's possible for us, I think that we severely limit our ability to do that if we don't have this rich fantasy life, because we need to be able to come up with ideas that aren't just fed to us. And so I think that, yes, there is a, a more negative connotation to fantasy, because they could be sexual fantasies or fantasies where you imagine hurting somebody else, or, you know, like you hate your boss and you imagine like a building falling on top of him or something like that. But I also think those are necessary as well. Like, I think we have to have the opportunity to kind of explore some of these darker aspects of ourselves, knowing that we're never gonna, you know, like, we really don't want a building to fall on top of our boss. But I think not being able to play out some of those scenarios is also detrimental for different reasons. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, it's interesting that I don't often think about the negative side of fantasies. For me, it tends to be more like this kind of amplification of what's possible if you had loads of resources and lots of power and lots of, I kind of, but I agree. It's about uh you're yeah, like you say, it's not like, oh, I have this idea and now I have to judge myself for having this thing, or what do I do with it? I've had this negative thing. It's like, it's just being like, we don't tend to take images that arise literally. They, this direct line to the unconscious, which is really like the realm of dreaming and fantasy, means, okay, here's a superficial image or idea, but there's a multi-dimension of communication going on that you can unpack and unfold. And like, let's just take your example of the building falling on the bus. It's just like, okay, doesn't take, you don't need a Jungian analyst to be like, maybe I need to make some changes in my work life. But there could be even more there, because it might be like a pattern of the point of, yeah, this whole thing about patterns is, you might have reoccurring fantasies that someone in authority comes to a bit of squashed under a building. You've got a pattern there, you've got something to work with. And again, it doesn't mean that you want anything bad to happen to any of these people, but it's telling you that there's very important information there about that dynamic that could be very, very important, that could liberate you to choose a different path that is more suitable. And that image, that fantasy image, is basically the guidance for that. So yeah, back to your question, yes, I think it's good to go wherever they go. Wherever they go, but just not literally.
Yeah. And I don't want to spend the whole conversation talking about fantasy, but you're right. Like, when we talk about shadow aspects of ourselves, those are the things that we would like to keep hidden. So I think having the opportunity to play out some of those scenarios brings to light, like you said, some of the things like, oh, okay, well, maybe my work life isn't that healthy, or my work-life balance is totally out of whack, or whatever the lesson or whatever it is that we are needing to learn can show up in those places. So we have to let ourselves have the opportunity to explore those things without having to take action, because that is a signal to us that, hey, maybe there is something I need. If I keep dreaming, if I keep having the same dream or the same nightmare or the same vision of, something terrible happening to my boss, that is really good information to say, okay, something has to change. And our subconscious is trying to tell us that, yes, we need to take action. Now, that action is not, the building falling on the boss, but it is saying, okay, there is something that needs to be looked at. And I think that that's important. But I also, when we think about, again, because I do energy work, and you think about the brow chakra, or the sometimes called the third eye chakra, this is our seat of the mind. It's our seat of intuition. And intuition and imagination are very intimately linked. So our ability to hear intuition, because it does speak to us in ways that are not linear, that aren't necessarily rational or practical, we need to be able to still be able to decipher that. And we've talked about the language of the soul. Now, the thing about our mind, the thing about our seat of imagination is it's multidimensional. It is outside of time and space. So images come up and might arise within us, and that might be really, really important information about, the direction we should take in our lives, or the decision we should make if we're, faced with like we're at a crossroads or a choice point moment. And so again, it's sort of a muscle that is diminishing as our focus becomes more and more externalized, and as all of these, like you were talking about, the escapism, the stories, all of that are being fed to us rather than being generated from within. And it doesn't all have to be generated within, but our ability to do that impacts a whole bunch of dimensions of our lives, like our ability to problem solve, our ability to innovate, our ability to create, our ability to listen to our own internal guidance system. All of that is intimately like related to our ability to imagine.
Yes, our internal guidance system. If if we lose the capacity to work with what is generated from within, then it's just like, look what is waiting to fill that space and hijack that space. And there's just nothing quite like if I'm working in a coaching dynamic with someone and they're struggling with like a lack of energy or meaning, then go straight to a place where you want to activate that inner world to get its, collage is a great way of doing that. We've talked before, like, just even if it's just pulling random images, you can flick through a magazine. If you just stop for a moment, just a moment, just pull it out and stick it somewhere, and don't try and like analyze it too much. It's just like you can see things in images that will bounce back to you. I mean, I feel like until we give an example really of how fantasy has, I'm using that word fantasy because I was listening to the Jungian podcast and they use that, and I was like, oh, I'm always afraid to use that word, so I'm kind of overusing it now. But really, imagination, we're talking about an imagination, but or in Jungian terms, the imaginal is quite a concrete place of imagination. Like archetypes are part of that infrastructure, right? They are a repeating universal pattern of behavior, archetypes, stages of life where we all find ourselves, the transitions between the different stages of life. We've talked before about maiden to mother. Whether you have children or not, as a woman, you're going to go through that transition of maiden to mother. These patterns, like, they don't exist. They do belong in the imaginal, like myth does as well. They are like, personal myth is like the story of your life making sense to you so you can find your place within the bigger story of the world. We have ancient mythology, we have ancient stories that are still relevant now. Those stories, they belong in the imaginal, but there's something very concrete about them. We can almost live in those spaces. And I think it's the same with when we activate the inner space within ourselves. That was it last episode, we were talking about this dance between, story and abstraction, and how somehow meaning unfolds between the two. And that doesn't just apply, to a painting process that I was referencing. That's life as well. We get snippets and flashes of story that appeal to us in some way, and we don't know why. And then we become like detectives to kind of start asking questions from these images or ideas.
Well,
And
example. I do have an example, but I want to touch first a little bit on that idea of fantasy as a energy builder.
Mm.
So because these ideas are generative, because They are something that arises from within us. There is an inherent creative energy that is that is part of that just through the process of imagining, right? Or visioning or daydreaming. So even if, and this is like when we talk about brainstorming is a great example, right? Like when there's no wrong answers and you throw out, hey, we'd like to create a class on this topic. And then people are just like, oh, let's, they're spitting out words, they're spitting out phrases, they're spitting out topic ideas, those sorts of things. And there is energy in that. And that you're able to kind of capitalize on. And that's the creative energy. Now, you might not be using all of those ideas, but the fact that you're in a playful state of imagination, there's palpable energy created from that. So being able to utilize those states as a way of building energy so that when you are in the action phase of things, you do already have sort of this reserve of creative energy that you've been kind of building and building and building. So then when it starts to take action, you can use that and put it forth into the project that you've imagined. And I think that the ability to try on ideas and play with them, like I kind of imagine it like putting on a coat and like twirling around, and how does this fit, and does it fit good, and what about this coat, let's play with that one, and let's try this one on. It's like playing dress up, but through that process you're really generating a lot of palpable creative life force.
Yes. Trying on possibility. What's this? Yeah, I used to have this phrase a lot, like identity play. I don't want to use that word now, but I think it was that. It was like trying on possibility without consequence. I've got an example that's come. Is it a good time to share?
Oh, it's a perfect time.
It's funny what came to mind. Because I was thinking that what led, I kind of, I walked away from my teaching job and what I've been doing it just before I turned 30. But there was a lot going on before that. And what got me to this example was you just talking about that slow build up for when you need it. And that's why it's always good to keep that fire stoked. So yeah, I'm just thinking like on a typical day coming back from a long commute where I was teaching in a school that was right in the middle of nowhere, a really dilapidated school, really stressful environment, and distinctly unglamorous, shall we say. And I used to get back to the town where I was living and go to the coffee shop. It was Borders, which I think it's gone bust now, like ages ago. But in those days, just ordering a drink, and I would get all the magazines of all the fashion magazines, pile them up like build myself a little hut out of piles of magazines. And even though I'd be really completely depleted and exhausted and just completely wrung out, it wasn't the caffeine in the tea. I didn't even drink caffeinated tea even then. It was like I'd get these fashion images going and I just start like devouring them, all this, incredible photography and the different collections. And I just go, like, go, 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 go. And I'd find that, quickly my energy would start to go up. And, in my mind, what am I doing? I'd literally be making it, I'd be making some kind of my own fashion collection, like bouncing off all these ideas and just really enjoying this absorption, right, of all this creative expression, and the complete opposite of where I'd been, right? Just this other world. It's a bit obvious maybe, but whatever. And then I'd come out after that and it would be like, okay, back to mundane, and I got to get back and clean the flat and make dinner before I go back and commute. But I remember like I'd come out and I'd be noticing that things felt brighter in the street. Let's just say it's a dismal day, it's a typical high street. I was tired when I went in. I've come out like something's just a little bit different because I've just been in that space. I just let my imagination go there. And then I'd kind of come out with the feeling that I was looking for something. And, there'd be so many charity shops selling different clothes. And I'd find like if something would just catch my eye in the window that was just even a little suggestion of all the ideas that I've been in, like, I don't know, like a color or a texture or whatever. And quite often there was, you know, and in those days, a lot of my energy went into, you know, creating outfits and having that creative expression on the outside, because, you know, I wasn't functioning as a artist the way that I am now. So any opportunities for expression were there. But I really used to feel like that this charged up feeling that if I could find an item like that evening or a few days later after a session like that, it would be like something had managed to cross over, like this little spark from that internal place, which is just like, obviously I don't have any money to buy any of this stuff. It's like way out of my mean and realm, but like suddenly here's this thing, like I found this hat and this style or this dress over this kind of similar fabric, and I can work with it. And in that way, there was this like crossover of energy. And as I'm talking, I'm like, well, what was it? It's like, it's no big deal. And then if anything, you could be like, wow, all that energy. And you just get like, you find a garment and you're really happy. Like you need to raise your expectations. But it used to give me that sense that I was on some kind of trail or quest, and that that imagination space where I had a lot of creative energy and kind of power, even in an imaginary sense, when I would experience that in a physical way, no matter how small in the life that I was struggling with, I took that as a sign, and I would feel like something was happening. And you could argue that that was delusional, but I've stayed with that kind of way of being, and it has borne fruit over time, you know, that sense that I'm looking for something, that I'm in a game, or not a game, a story that has more meaning than the one that doesn't have that level of I'm doing that with, which is to symbolize me doing the magazine devouring, which is what stoked the fire, which, you know, if you're wondering what this is. But this can be any time that you really let yourself go there. This can apply to any time that you just are immersed in an imaginative space that is generating. And I don't think it matters so much that it was, you know, other people's fashion design. You know, we've all got to have some kind of stimulus and inspiration, right?
Well, that
That's what.
reminds me of several things. So I recently, well, not recently, a while ago, I wrote an article about synchronicity, which that Carl Jung coined that term.
Yeah.
And he would talk about us, and this speaks to your idea of archetypes and that imaginal space. And he through a series of about a decade, they wrote correspondences back and forth, him and this physicist. And he really believed that we would pull those experiences that we wanted from the universal. So from the realm of the imaginal, from the archetypal, the essence of things. And so you finding that specific hat and you feeling like you're sort of kind of following this trail of breadcrumbs that the universe is leaving for you, that is exactly what synchronicity is. It is you pulling from that imaginal space that which creates more meaning. And he actually talked about that synchronicities were not in the realm of cause and effect. It was actually meaning and affinity that would pull those things towards us. So you finding that beautiful, like that connection of color or that dress or that hat is really you calling from the imaginal space that which provides more meaning and the opportunity for more growth and development. So I think that that is really cool, because when we think about imagination too, it's expansive. And so being able to play and not immediately go into this contractive state of, well, that's not reasonable or logical, or I can't really do this, I don't have enough money, or whatever the reason is, that you can all of a sudden take this big dream or this vision and collapse it down into something that's contracted and illogical or whatever. I think that is also a huge disservice for us, not as only as individuals, but when we think about how we need to write a new story for humanity, we need to not immediately collapse down into contraction. We need to stay open and play with those imaginal spaces and think about, okay, what's meaningful? What can we call towards us as individuals? What can we call towards us as like the collective in order to create a dream or a different story for humanity at this time. So I love the idea. I was able to pull from the imaginal space, and I'm like, I see how that's connected.
Yeah. Yeah, this phrase like dream consciousness, this thing about the collective dreaming space, which we so need now. And then as you were talking and drawing attention to this enormous amount of energy, you were expansive, but I keep coming back to this idea of it generates energy. And if I look back at the last 20 years and I think about how much change, like transformation, I'm like, where did the energy come for all of that? Like, it's awe-inspiring. It came from, I think, not losing touch with the generator of energy. And that's on an individual level. But when we talk about like the big story, which we're being called, and if the majority of us, if our batteries are flat and that capacity, I don't know, that's just what's coming to mind now, that it's almost like we practice this on an individual level, but we know, I don't know, but it's like it can sound very individualistic, this kind of questing on our own interior and indulging ourselves in these kind of imaginative, exploratory ways. But I know that the ripple effect of that is entirely positive. Like when you have more available for yourself, you have more available for those around you, and you have more available for those around you, then that has the knock-on effect to the people that you're available for, and so forth. So I think with all of these things, I still think I would love to know and experience more about what it's going to take for more collective dreaming, but I don't know.
Well, we kind of are collective dreaming, but we're doing it in probably the worst possible way, right? So we are imagining things. We're just stuck in this place of imagining like the worst case scenarios
Oh
all
gosh, that
the time,
phrase.
right? So it's like, again, we've gone and we've collapsed into contraction, into like the reasons why this can't work, or, oh, it's just human nature, or, we've created these stories, but they don't serve us, and they're incredibly negative. And that's where when we think about like the collective fear and all of that, we are creating that, even if it's somewhat unconsciously. But it's coming from such a place of contraction versus this. It's a totally different feel to be visioning, to be playful, to imagine, to, generate that energy in an upwardly mobile place versus like cutting down into contraction.
I mean, I guess what's difficult, and like I hear you say that, and I'm like, am I only just realizing now? Like, of course, it's so easy to gain consensus on what we don't want. I guess it's a lot harder to gain a consensus on what we do, Like it feels like we can agree. Well, I don't know, I don't want to get into this dark terrain now, but we've seen with recent events how collective thought forms can just like bring everybody in because it's so simplistic in a way. It's just like, not that thing. But it's like if you try and flip that around, yeah, but that it is kind of landing in my system, that parallel between that, we've spoken about it, but I feel like it's landing even more how important it is to cultivate on an individual level, because it just means that you can say yes to yourself, which means you can say yes to other people. And that what you say, I could see it when you were talking about the upward spiral. It's just like we've got loads of experience on the downward spiral. It's harder to generate the energy, is that word again, for the upward spiral. There's a lot more questions. It takes a lot more experience. Maturity is a word that comes in. And again, you think of fantasy and maturity tend to be at odds because, again, I've had lots of words thrown at me, you don't want to grow up, you want to stay in your fantasy life forever, blah, blah, blah. I mean, yeah, I mean, you can throw that at artists and creatives very easily.
But we need a little bit more of that right now. And there's this, because so much is being generated for us by staring at a screen, we moved into this place of like learned helplessness. Um,
Oof. Ooh.
and we have spoken before. There's this woman, she's a researcher called Jean Twenge, and she's written several books on the differences between generations. And I first read her book called iGen in 2017 because I have a child who's of the Gen Z, or some people call the iGen, and just how much technology has changed this generation. It actually started with like the more recent millennials, and then the subsequent generations after. And what really shifted is that idea of most of that stimulation is not generated internally, but coming from a screen. And what they've realized through her research is that, like, especially for the most recent generation that's like graduating, going into adulthood now, that they didn't have like very low self-confidence, they have low self-efficacy, they have a certain like standard pessimism that exists, like they don't want to have children, they're less likely to even leave their house without their parents, they're less likely to have, long-term intimate relationships, they're even less likely to drive. And how this is like manifesting is they're less likely to try things,
Mm.
because, and part of that is their stunted imagination, their stunted ability to like think about what else is possible, because and part of that's parenting. They've called like helicopter parents, and now it's no plow parenting, where they literally like remove all the obstacles from children so that they don't ever have to feel sad or bad or whatever. And then their whole lives is being stimulated by what they're seeing on their screen. And so that translates into learned helplessness, where they really feel like they don't have the ability to make any sort of positive change in their life. So all of these things are very intimately related to one another, and it doesn't help us when we think about dealing with our existential threats and writing a new story for the new earth.
Mm.
So it is kind of bleak.
I feel so sad and I feel it's it's so unfair to lay that on these generations that are labeled like this. I think the learned helplessness began with the television set and the news and the, and I have this visual in my mind that you know it started a while ago, this shrinking space. And it's no surprise that a generation can be born into this already very complicated hijacked space. And it can seem like, oh, because of the phones and the culture around phones. But what about the dream consciousness of, my parents, their parents, and yeah, in a way, it just seems like there was like a brief moment in recent times where it kind of felt safe enough to have um, the space physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually to do a little bit of exploration, and then it just closed again, like oh. So yeah, I don't know. It's all I know is in my line of work, the kind of creating that I'm interested in and the way that it's like a journey of discovery. It's just like if I want to work with individuals or a group, I want to get into that, not like I want to, but it's necessary, I find, to just get into that terrain. It's just like if you really want to know who you are at that deep level, and if you want to be able to connect with others from that, then there's got to be some exploration with the imaginal and allowing yourself to receive image, ideas, suggestions, fantasy. Otherwise, there's just this cutoff, there's this deadening, there's this dismissal. And what does that mean? It means the only space that you have is going to come from this predetermined, I'm referring to like all the external fillers that we have. It's a really, it's a way more complex topic somehow when we get into it on that expanded level. But I feel like the origin of it is so innocent. I mean, we can talk about the shadow side of fantasy, and it has all these detrimental effects, and there's, of course, there's a reason that caution is attached there, but this we talk about the aliveness, right? When we're talking about the taglines and trust the alive. We talk about trusting the aliveness, following it, nurturing sparks. That's really relevant to what we're talking about, and we should get onto the exercise. That's gonna.
We should. I was going to say, yeah, that's a good segue. We like to present our listeners with a creative challenge every week. And this week, we're going to help you kind of expand and play with ideas and really get into what we were talking about today, with kind of being able to create stuff from within and create a little mini universe. So we will get back to that in just a moment. All right. All right. So this is the segment of the show where we like to challenge our listeners to try something that helps them dive deeper into the topics that we talk about, to explore it from a different place. And today we are creating a cafe. So I'm going to let you describe it.
Yes. And I just want to encourage, because the feedback coming from these exercises is really cool. It's really interesting. And this one in particular, I think, I don't quite know if Instagram is the best place, because there's a curiosity. If you do this kind of exercise, you're like, okay, this is what mine turned out like. I really want to hear about other people's. So this exercise I came across, I follow a lot of different Jungian based online collectives and learning sources. And this exercise was that you're invited to, with unlimited resources, time, and vision, create a cafe exactly the way you would want it. And to take into consideration where it exists, the location, what kind of hours it opens, what the decor inside is like, what kind of people are going there, what are people up to within this cafe, what are the notable features. So we talked at the beginning about like an opportunity to experience oneself anew, and for that we need a change in parameters. And we talked about travel being an obvious one, but and a lot of these writers that we were quoting from at the beginning, they construct these imaginary worlds. So this is an invitation to construct an imaginary world with that kind of serious intention, and to go with it. And it's, I don't know if I want to say too much about when it's done. I can put it in the show notes. It's better just to go in and we'll bullet point all the kind of prompts, like where is it, who's going, what is the time, what are the features, but straight away just go with all these exercises. It's really just go with what comes first, not getting too much into, oh, should it be this, should it be that. As soon as you start kind of getting too heavily into discernment and trying to like bring your, I don't know, inner architect on, like you just too much energy. It should just be really just like, okay, I'm in Japan, I'm in a back alley, and there's a Siamese cat right there on the door, and I'm selling soup, and just go like that.
Yeah, because that's the whole thing, right? As soon as you start, you're like, oh, well, that would go against building codes. There was no way, you know what I mean? Like we're trying to get out of that contractive spiral and go into the expansive one. So yeah, this is it's for your imagination. It's to create something out of nothing that's generative, and it doesn't need to,
Makes sense.
yeah, make sense at all. Like it could
Hmm.
be a talking cat, a talking Siamese cat that
Hmm.
likes to read the specials, or
Yeah,
I one
absolutely. Playful.
one of the things, I have a lot of friends that are my age, and they have young kids, you being one of them. And I talk a lot about, like, I'll go out, for example, I was going over to my friend's house and I was playing this game and we were playing with Lego, and then it turned into like sort of this battle in space, and we're creating different noises for laser guns, and and having so much fun. She's like, how do you know how to do that? I'm like,
Wow.
what do you mean? She's like, how, like, you just created this whole thing out of your head. And I'm like, yeah, because it's fun, right? Like, like you have to create the story and all of that. And so this is a perfect challenge to be able to just create anything that just out of your imagination. It doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to be realistic. And in fact, the less realistic, the better. Like, just create.
Yeah, I'm just going to throw in something there because I'm listening, because I know there's going to be a lot of listeners which are like, great, I love this kind of thing. And there is going to be a listener who's going to be like, oh, I get that kind of feeling of contraction, because without practice and a regular, I'm doing this like without massaging that space. And I also recently was asked to dream big. It was on one of the coaching calls we were on together, and I really struggled. And it's not always something that we can turn on. And don't worry if it feels like a little bit difficult. Like, give yourself a little bit of space and encouragement. Like, there's parameters here in this exercise that are important. It's not like create anything. It is like, it's a cafe. It's going to be a building. It's going to serve something, and it's going to have some kind of interior. So just get really simple. It's just like, okay, a building in my mind. What paint, what color is it inside, and what kind of food am I serving? Like, make it as simple as you need to get the first image. And then once you've got one, you'll get the rest. That's just, I just wanted to throw out there, because sometimes the mind just goes, I can't do this. Like, I was asked to be completely unlimited recently, and I noticed that since I've had my daughter, I don't do unlimited very often, only in like safe exercises like this, which I think is, for me, is probably a good thing.
All right. So disregard everything I said and listen to Gemma.
No, it was both. It was both. Yours was like you went the wow, and I was like, actually, I'm gonna come in and go put some even more here, because sometimes sometimes with the big imagination, we need a little bit of to get it to
Okay.
go.
Okay. Well, I'm excited to do this one too. Um,
Mhm.
yeah. So what is our hashtag? So if with all of these, we have a TGF something hashtag for Instagram, so that if you listen to this at any time, or on any of our channels, social media channels, you can look for that hashtag. So is this TGF Cafe or TGF Fantasy?
I think the safest thing to do is always be TGF Creative Challenge, because we always put that one. I guess at some point there's going to be a shit ton. So what did you say? TGF
TGF
Creative.
Cafe.
Yeah, TGF Cafe.
That's
Simple.
very specific. Nobody's
No one's gonna have
come up with a million hits on that. It'll be very direct.
that.
Okay. Well, that is our episode for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you want to find out more about Gemma, you can go to GemmaKaufman.com.
Yeah.
If you want to find out more about myself, you can go to chaosandlight.com. And you can find us at Golden Flower Podcast on Instagram and the Golden Flower YouTube channel. That's where we post our videos and other cool things that we create. Well, that's it for today. Follow the aliveness, nurture that spark, and have a great week.